In 1962, you could walk into a Dodge dealership and buy a plain four-door family car. Nothing about it looks special. Flat sides, simple trim, a back seat for the children. And under the bonnet sat an engine that the factory itself did not want you to drive. Not a warning from a magazine, not a rumor from the racetrack. A warning printed by Chrysler in Chrysler's own brochure about Chrysler's own car. It said, in plain words, that this engine was designed for supervised acceleration trials, and that it was not recommended for general everyday driving. Read that again. The company that built it told you not to use it on the road. This is the story of the Max Wedge, and of the 2 short years when Detroit lost its mind. To understand why Chrysler did something so strange, you have to understand how much trouble it was in. In the late 1950s, American cars were enormous. Long, low, wide, and covered in chrome and fins. And the men running Chrysler made a decision that nearly finished the company. They decided that the fashion was about to swing the other way, that buyers were about to turn against the giant car. So, for 1962, they shrank their Dodges and their Plymouths. They took their full-size cars and made them smaller. It was a catastrophe. Buyers walked into the showrooms, looked at the new cars, and walked straight back out. The styling was strange, the proportions looked wrong. And, worst of all, the cars simply looked small next to a Chevrolet or a Ford. In America, in 1962, looking small was not a compliment. Sales collapsed. Dealers panicked. The company was bleeding. But there was one thing nobody at Chrysler had planned for. Those shrunken cars were light. Much lighter than the enormous machines coming out of General Motors and Ford. And in one particular corner of America, weight was everything. Strip. Every weekend, across the United States, thousands of people gathered at the strips. 2 cars, a quarter of a mile, a straight line. The simplest contest in motorsport and the most brutal. And Detroit had discovered something. Winning on Sunday sold cars on Monday. A factory car that beat the rivals at the strip was worth more than any advertisement. So Chrysler looked at its ruined, shrunken cars. And it had an idea. The car was light. What if the engine was enormous? Not tuned, not adjusted, enormous. What if they took a racing engine and simply sold it to the public? In a family sedan, with a back seat and a radio. The engine they chose was already there, in a way. Chrysler had a big block V8 known as the Wedge, named for the shape of its combustion chambers. It was strong, but it was ordinary, a workhorse. And Chrysler's engineers now set about turning that workhorse into something else entirely. They called the result the Maximum Performance Wedge. Everyone else called it the Max Wedge. They started with 413 cubic inches, just under 7 liters. And then they went through the engine, part by part, and made every single choice for one purpose: speed. The camshaft was aggressive, with solid lifters that hammered away with no forgiveness. The pistons were aluminium and made to be light. The connecting rods were checked with magnetic inspection, hunting for cracks that human eyes cannot see. Because at the revs this engine would see, a hidden flaw in a rod does not stay hidden for long. On top sat not 1 carburetor but 2. 2 Carter 4 barrels, each capable of gulping 650 cubic feet of air every minute. They were mounted on a cast iron intake that split into 2 long curving branches. It looked like the horns of a bull sitting on top of the engine. It even earned a nickname for that shape, the crossram. Air came in, took the long way round, and arrived at the cylinder with a punch. And then there were the headers. Not exhaust manifolds, headers. Great cast iron tubes that swept up along the side of the engine before curling away underneath. Most cars of that era hid their exhaust plumbing. The Max Wedge wore it like armor. The compression was savage. On the highest version, 11:1, later 13.5:1. That is not a road car number, that is a race car number. It means the engine squeezes the fuel and air so hard that ordinary petrol will not survive it. You needed racing fuel, real racing fuel. Put normal petrol in a 13:1 Max Wedge and it would hammer itself apart. And the output? Chrysler quoted 410 horsepower on the milder version, and 420 on the wild one. In 1962, in a family Dodge that a man might buy to drive his wife to church. Now think about what that actually means. 420 horsepower, in a light car, in an era of narrow tires and drum brakes. There was no traction control, there were no seatbelts unless you paid extra. There was no way to stop it quickly, because the brakes were the same drums fitted to the ordinary car. It would go like nothing else on the street. Stopping was your problem. And Chrysler knew it. Which brings us back to that extraordinary line in the factory literature. The brochure did not brag, it warned. Designed for supervised acceleration trials. Not recommended for general everyday driving, because of the compromises in the all-round characteristics. Read past the polite language and it says something remarkable. We built this, we will sell it to you, but please do not drive it to the shops. There has never been anything quite like it since. A modern manufacturer would never dare. The lawyers would not allow a single word of it. But in 1962, Chrysler wrote it down, printed it, and handed it across the counter with the keys. And the cars themselves went further still. If you were serious, you did not order the comfortable version. You ordered the stripped one. You could have a Dodge 330 or a Plymouth Savoy with the interior taken out. The heater was gone, the radio was gone, the sound deadening was gone. The rear seat could go too. Every pound removed was a pound that did not need accelerating. And then Chrysler went further than any American manufacturer had gone before. It offered aluminium body panels, the bonnet, the wings, the front bumper supports. Made of aluminium instead of steel, straight from the factory. Not from a specialist, not from a tuner, from the assembly line. And it moved a battery. On a standard car, the battery sits at the front, under the bonnet near the engine. On the Max Wedge cars, Chrysler moved it into the boot. The reason is pure physics. When a car launches hard, weight transfers backwards, over the rear wheels. Put a heavy battery over those rear wheels, and they push down harder into the tarmac. More grip, less wheel spin, a faster launch. That is not a road car decision. That is not even a performance car decision. That is a race car decision made by a factory on a car sold to the public. Chrysler was building drag racers, giving them number plates, and selling them like Sunday sedans. And then the world found out what they had done. July 1962. A Plymouth Savoy with a Max Wedge under the bonnet went to the strip. Its name was the Melrose Missile, and it did something no factory-built stock car had ever done. It ran the quarter mile in 11.93 seconds. Take a moment with that number. 11.93. Until that day, no showroom stock car had broken into the 11-second bracket. It was a wall. Everyone knew it was there. And a four-door Plymouth with a bench seat went straight through it. The reaction was immediate and total. The Max Wedge cars became the undisputed kings of superstock. For 1962 and 1963, they simply could not be beaten by anything from Ford or General Motors. Every weekend, the same thing happened. The plain-looking Dodges and Plymouths would line up against far more glamorous machines, and they would leave them behind. The nickname the racers used was simple, Mopar. And for 2 seasons, Mopar owned the strip. Chevrolet's answer was too heavy. Ford's answer was not ready. The little shrunken cars that nobody wanted in the showroom had become untouchable on the track. And here is the irony that makes this story what it is. The Max Wedge existed because Chrysler made a terrible mistake. If the 1962 cars had been full size, like everybody expected, they would have been too heavy. The engine would have been strangled by the weight. The catastrophe in the showroom was the reason for the triumph at the strip. The failure created the legend. But motorsport has a way of correcting itself. When one manufacturer dominates completely, the rules change. And for the 1963 season, the National Hot Rod Association acted. It set a limit on engine size for factory superstock cars, 427.2 cubic inches. Not a round number, a very precise one. And that single number rewrote Detroit. It is the reason the Ford 427 exists. It is the reason the Chrysler 426 exists. Both engines were built to sit just underneath that line and not 1 inch above it. An entire generation of American engines was shaped by a rulebook. So Chrysler bored out the Max Wedge. 413 cubic inches became 426. The Stage 2 version arrived in 1963. 415 horsepower, or 425 depending on the compression. The heads were reworked, the ports grew, the valves grew, and the cars kept winning. There was a Stage 3 in 1964. It was the sharpest of them all. By now, the whole recipe was refined. Every part of it was aimed at that quarter mile. And the Max Wedge stood at the top of American drag racing. And then, in the same year, Chrysler ended it. Not because it failed, because Chrysler built something better. In 1964, the Hemi returned. 426 cubic inches, but with hemispherical combustion chambers. A different shape, a different breathing. And it was simply superior. The Hemi took everything the Max Wedge had learned and went further. It went to NASCAR and dominated so completely that the sport banned it. It went to the strip and rewrote the records. It became the most famous engine name in American history, and in its shadow, the Max Wedge quietly disappeared. That is why almost nobody talks about it now. The Hemi is a legend. The Hemi is on t-shirts and posters and film posters. The Max Wedge is the engine that came before and got replaced. 2 seasons at the very top, and then a footnote. But look at the numbers, and you see how special it really was. In 1962, Chrysler built just 214 Max Wedge Dodges and 298 Plymouths. 512 cars in a country of 180 million people. It was never a mass product, it was never meant to be. It was a machine built for one purpose, sold quietly, to people who knew exactly what they were buying. And there is another detail that tells you everything about Chrysler's intentions. The Max Wedge was never available in a Chrysler, never in an Imperial, only in the plain, unglamorous Dodges and Plymouths. The company's own luxury brands were kept well away from it. This engine was not for the boardroom, it was for the strip. Think about what it would be like to see one. You are at a set of traffic lights in 1963. Beside you pulls up a beige Plymouth Savoy, 4 doors, no badges to speak of. An ordinary car, driven by an ordinary man. And then the lights change. And that beige sedan is simply gone, in a howl of solid lifters and a cloud of tire smoke. That was the Max Wedge experience. It looked like nothing. It was everything. The people who owned them understood exactly what they had. These were not comfortable cars. The clutch was heavy. The engine was loud, harsh, and impatient at low speed. It hated traffic. It hated sitting still. The solid lifters clattered like a workshop. And you had to feed it racing fuel, or it would destroy itself. The factory had told you not to drive it every day, and the factory had been right. But that was never the point. Point was, the moment when the road opened up. When the 2 4-barrels came open and 11-to-1 compression did its work. When 420 horsepower arrived in a car that weighed almost nothing. For a few seconds you were driving the fastest thing on any street in America. And you had bought it from a dealer with a warranty book in the glove box. Today, a genuine Max Wedge car is worth a fortune. The survivors are counted and cataloged and argued over. The aluminium panels are almost impossible to find. The cross-ram intakes with their bullhorn shape are treasures on their own. And when one starts, at a show, on a quiet morning, everybody turns around. Because nothing else sounds like it. The Max Wedge lasted 2 full seasons and a little more. It was born from a corporate disaster. It won because of a mistake nobody meant to make. It was so extreme that its own creator printed a warning about it. And then it was replaced by something even better, and history moved on. But for 2 short years, Chrysler did something no company would ever dare to do again. It built a racing engine. It put it in a family car. It sold it to anybody with the money. And then, in its own brochure, in its own words, it looked the customer in the eye. And it said, "This is not really meant for the road." And it sold them anyway,